Okay, so last class we were talking about groundwater, and we ended the class talking about the collapse of aquifers. The whole science behind the collapse of aquifers is that the rocks beneath the surface have anywhere from a few percent to maybe 25% pores. In the saturated zone, those pores are completely filled by water. The water isn't compressible, so the pressure of all the overlying rock being pulled down by gravity can't collapse the pores because the water essentially can't squish. But when we put wells into the ground and start extracting water, lowering the water table, creating cones of depression, we change the situation from the pores being filled with water to the pores being filled with water and some air. And at that point, there isn't any support on those pores, and the pores can start to collapse. And we ended, I think, with this photo right here that shows in the San Joaquin Valley of California, which is a big agricultural area. Yet it's really dry, so they need water for the agriculture, and they get it out of a massive array of groundwater wells. But from the water that's being extracted from the ground for growing the crops, the water table is lowered and the aquifer is starting to collapse. And this shows just how much collapse has occurred over the last, in this case, 50 years or so. Pretty substantial. It looks like a couple of stories, maybe 20 feet. So the groundwater is a lot lower. The pores are collapsing, causing the surface above to lower. Remember that when the pores collapse, then the water table cannot, or the aquifer cannot be recharged with water because there's just no pore space. So these aquifers end up getting ruined. The thing about the settling is that a lot of times it's not even. It's not perfectly symmetrical across a big area. Some areas drop a little faster than others, and that can lead to massive ground cracks, which obviously it's a bummer if this is your land, but you also have to remember that we bury lots of utilities in the ground to protect them from people. Water lines, gas lines, electrical lines, telephone lines. And when you have this uneven settling, ground cracking going on, anything that's buried can be negatively impacted. Sewer lines, lines to septic systems. So these things can be broken, impacted, can cost an awful lot of money to fix. People can be without services for a while, and it can be a real mess. So this is one of the unintended consequences of massive groundwater withdrawal, is the collapse of the pore space in the aquifers. Not only does it affect things on the Earth's surface, as you see here, but it affects the long-term ability of these aquifers to transmit water in the future. So we're at a point now where in many areas, especially in the United States West, we're depleting the storage of these aquifers at a rate that just isn't sustainable long term. Okay, so that's kind of the science background on groundwater. We talked about the unsaturated zone, where we have rock, air, and water. We have the saturated zone, where we have rock and water. The boundary between those two is the water table. When you start pumping a well, you get a local lowering of the water table that looks like a cone-shaped dip, and that's called a cone of depression. That can greatly affect your well's ability to give you water. It can affect the ability of people nearby to extract groundwater as well. So what we're going to do now is sort of move on and talk about how humans use water. I just want you to take maybe 2 or 3 minutes and just jot down the ways that you think that you can use water every day. Just some will be really obvious, maybe some not so much, but just go through this thought exercise for me for just a minute or two. Okay, what sort of things do you have listed? Just throw a few out for me. Anybody? Anna. Bathing. Okay. We clean things, right? We clean ourselves, clean dishes. Sometimes we wash cars. What else? Agriculture. Yeah, you might not see it every day, but all that food that you buy, I can't think of any food source that can be produced without water. What else? Recreation. We use water a lot for recreation, right? I know I do. Some things are really obvious, some things you see. Second question I have for you is how much water do you think you use a day? 30 gallons? It's a lot, right? It's not even close to what you use on average. The average American uses a bit more. You want to take a guess how much more? 40 more gallons? So 70 gallons? No. 100? 180 gallons? It's a lot of water. That's about 1/10 of what you actually. The average American uses about 1,800 gallons of water a day. And you're going to say, there's absolutely no way. But what you're not seeing are some of the invisible uses of water that you're responsible for. You know, the things that you have on there, you can probably see that water use. Bathing, drinking, watering the lawn, recreation. Some things are not so obvious. Agriculture, right? You buy an avocado, it doesn't look like water to you, right? It looks like an avocado. The other thing is look at all the stuff in this room. Just about every single thing in this room requires water in the production, especially when we look at plastics and metals, anything that requires machinery to produce. A lot of times that machinery is actually cooled down by water. Okay, so there are many sorts of water uses that are kind of invisible to us. So we know that there are ways that we use water directly and we use water indirectly. And sometimes we take water out of the natural system permanently. And sometimes, like with recreation, we just go out in nature and use it. We float our boats on it, go fishing in it, whatever it might be. So some things consume water, take it out of the water cycle. Some things use water, not necessarily take it out of the water cycle, or you take it out, you put it back. That happens a lot in industry where they're taking water out of nature, they're using it to cool down machinery, then they just dump it back into nature after they're done using it. So some water is used, and yet other water is then removed from the system, and that's called water consumption. And then think over the top of all this, what's happening worldwide to human population. It's growing. A lot of these people are living on coastlines where water is there and is an integral part of the society and culture and gets used and consumed by the folks that live there. So water use and consumption by humans is likely to keep going up. All right, just some facts. I'll give you a few factoids as background. We'll start with water use just here in the United States. It's estimated on average that the US land surface gets about 4.2 trillion gallons of rain per day. I don't expect you to somehow visualize what 4.2 trillion gallons looks like. And it's not really important because it's the numbers that we'll compare it to that really tell the story. So 4.2 trillion gallons of rain land on the Earth's surface. Once it lands on the Earth's surface, what can happen to that water? What are some ways that water then, once it hits the surface, where does it go? Some of it soaks into the ground, right? Some of it infiltrates. That's what we call it. So it soaks into the ground. Does it all soak in the ground? Some of it then does what? some of it evaporates straight back up, right? So if it doesn't soak in the ground and it doesn't evaporate up, then what does it do? It'll flow over the surface into some water source, typically first a stream, river, lake. That's called overland flow or runoff, okay? So those are kind of the three immediate ways that water responds to landing on the ground. So 4.2 trillion gallons of rain falls per day. Of that, 2/3 of it either is evaporated or sucked up by plants. So that leaves 1/3 of it to run off and infiltrate into the ground. So 1 out of every 3 raindrops ends up in either a surface water system, a stream, lake, or river, or ultimately the ocean, or infiltrates into the ground to recharge groundwater systems. So yeah, out of every 3 raindrops, 2 of them plants take up or go right back into the atmosphere. Now, the big problem that we're facing here in the United States is that infiltration, remember we've been talking about groundwater, that infiltration that can recharge aquifers, unfortunately, doesn't always happen where the most groundwater is sucked out of the ground. If you look at where it rains in the United States in general, we get lots of rain in the eastern part of the US, not so much out here in the west. Yet out here in the west is where we suck groundwater out a lot because we don't have a lot of surface water. So it's an unsustainable process. We're sucking water out of the ground because we don't have surface water. The reason we don't have surface water is because it's really dry. And because it's really dry, we don't recharge the aquifers after we extract the groundwater from them. So out here in the arid west, parts of California, where groundwater extraction is happening at a large scale, especially near these big cities in the west, Denver, one of them. If you look at the area around Denver, there's not a lot of natural water sources for people to tap into. And in fact, we've done all sorts of weird things to bring water to the Front Range of Colorado. We have tunnels through mountains to bring water from the western slope of the Rockies to the Front Range. We have aqueducts, water transfers, all sorts of things. I live over by Fort Collins near Windsor, and right now they're putting in a big series of pipe to bring water from the Poudre River down towards Denver. So we move water around a lot from where it exists to where the people are. But we have more people and more water use than what we can naturally sustain here long term. Okay, we're going to look at some numbers here. We're going to start real basic. So here in the US, we have 250, 300 million people or so. We'll go with 250. It makes the numbers work out right, but you'll see where this goes in a minute. Just to keep you alive till tomorrow, you need a gallon of water. We basically all need a gallon of water just to stay alive. So at a minimum, for everyone in the US to live till tomorrow and the next day and the next day, we need about 250 million gallons of water available to people in the US every day. That's the bare minimum. So if that's all the water we had, you'd be able to drink your water, but you wouldn't be able to wash anything, wouldn't be able to do all those other things that you put on your list earlier about how you use water. So nationwide, we need 250 million gallons a day just to keep people alive. But here's what I was getting at a little while ago. We actually use 450 billion gallons of water per day, or 1,800 times that amount. Now, this does not include water travel, like barges and things that use for shipping. We'll show in a minute exactly what we're talking about here. Now, I asked you before how much you think you use a day. A lot of people say, oh, I don't know, 5 to 10 gallons. You said 30. That's what you sort of see your water use is. If I had to guess, I'd probably say 30 to 50 because I water my stupid lawn in the summer, and I know it takes a lot of water. But I certainly don't see myself using 1,800 gallons of water a day. That's a lot of water. But that sort of water use is invisible, yet it's absolutely required to live the sort of lifestyle that we're living. A lot of it is because of the products we buy. Okay, of that 1,800 gallons per day for 250 million people, which equates to about 450 billion gallons per day nationwide. Why is it so much? Where is it going? Well, as it turns out, the first two categories, industry and irrigation. Industry makes stuff that you want to buy. Irrigation makes the food you want to eat. So like I said, when you pick up an avocado, you don't see the water use. When you buy a computer, you don't see the water use. When you use electricity, you don't see the water use. We use water for energy production an awful lot. Fossil fuels use it for fracking. Hydroelectric dams obviously use it. If you look at the bottom two, that is water use for people living in cities, municipal, and rural areas. That's human water use in those areas. It only comes to 10%. Now you'll see a lot of people say, oh, I'm going to get a low flow toilet, or I'm going to put a brick in my toilet to down my water use. I'm going to shut off the faucet when I'm brushing my teeth. I'm not saying you guys shouldn't do that. It's all good to do. But that only gets at that 3 and 7% category. Where is most of the water being used? Industry and irrigation. If we really want to extend our water supply, those are the areas we have to target because they use the most water. And there's not a lot of talk about how we do that in this country right now. So water consumed and water used. We looked at this a little bit already. Water use is where you take water, do something with it, and then put it back into nature. Water consumption is where you take water, do something with it, and it doesn't go back into nature. So you can argue that water consumption is the one we should probably be the most worried about, because that's water that's permanently extracted. A lot of industry use is taking water, say, from a stream to an industry, and then, for instance, that industry might use the water to cool off big machinery. What it does in the process is it heats the water up, and then they dump it back into nature. So they might not actually be consuming any water long term. They're taking it out and putting it back, but they're putting it back in a different state. They're putting it back, in this case, much warmer. Is that polluting the water? This happens a lot with nuclear plants. You have a nuclear plant, they're always next to a water body. And what they do is they take water out of that water body and it cools down the nuclear reactor. And then the hot water is dumped back out into nature. Is that pollution? Does that fit your definition of pollution? When you hear about pollution, what do you think? Putting something in water that wasn't there before, right? In this case, you're not putting any chemicals in it, right? You're not putting any viruses in it. You're not putting any biological material. You're just heating it up. Is that pollution? Okay, think about this. Let's say that water that was taken out of the stream by industry was 42 degrees. Nice cold water, right? Now, fish like trout love 42-degree water. Trout is a species that needs lots of oxygen. With water, the lower the temperature, the more oxygen can be dissolved. What happens in the summer around here, especially in places like Steamboat Springs, they have the Yampa River. In the summer, the water temperatures go way up, and the amount of oxygen in the water goes way down, and the fish get super stressed and some die. And what they do about midsummer on the Yampa River is they say, okay, people, you cannot kayak or inner tube or swim or fish in the river anymore, because these fish are already so stressed because the water temperatures are high and the oxygen level is low. We have to let the water levels come up. We have to let the water temperatures go down before you can get back on the water. So if you have an industry that's taking water from a 42-degree stream and putting back 70-degree water, and you're a trout, are you happy with this situation? No, that's something we call thermal pollution. You're not actually adding a chemical to it, but you're changing the state of water in a way that's every bit as harmful to the aquatic ecosystem as dumping in a bunch of cyanide. You know, if the trout dies because the water's 70 degrees, trout's not going to care if it died from heat or died from cyanide. It's dead. And we don't want that. So with water use, where you take water out of a stream and put it back, that doesn't mean that everything's all okay. It's certainly, in terms of the amount of water, better than extracting it and never returning it. But even using it can modify it in a way that can be harmful for the environment and ecosystems. So of that, roughly 1,800 gallons per day that you use, only about a quarter of that water is actually consumed. Most of it is taken out and put back. A lot of times it's put back exactly the same state it came out. No worries, no harm, no foul. Sometimes it's put back a little warmer, not so good. Sometimes it's taken out, stuff gets added to it, chemicals and things, and then it's put back, and that can be really bad for the environment. But a quarter of that water is actually removed and never put back in the system. And if we look at who's responsible for the consumption, this is probably not a big surprise to you, it's irrigation. About 80% of all the water consumed is because of irrigation. And sadly, a third to a half of that is groundwater. Because remember, a lot of the irrigation is happening in places that are dry. That's why we're irrigating it. California, Texas are the two biggest consumers, but that's where we get our vegetables in the winter. You go and you see lettuce in the store, probably came from California. Spinach, California. Citrus, probably Arizona and Texas. So without this consumption of water, we would not live the way we do today, quite simply. But We can probably do better with our water consumption if we change just a few things, which is something we'll get to here in a second. So we have water use, water consumption, and of water consumption, irrigation is the big spender. Industry, cities, and rural, rather insignificant when it comes to water consumption. I remember a minute ago I was talking about thermal pollution, how industries a lot of times take cold water and put warm water back. Sometimes we do the opposite, and it has just a deadly effect. The Colorado River is a great example. I'm going to have you guys watch a video next Tuesday. We actually won't have formal class on Tuesday. I hate having class Tuesday before Thanksgiving because people either don't show up or they're crabby about showing up. So I'll usually save my favorite video, and it's about the Colorado River. And one thing about the Colorado River is that before humans messed with it, it was a warm water river. I mean, it's flowing through the west, it's flowing through the desert southwest. It was warm and muddy. It was like 70 to 80 degrees and just a muddy torrent. And over time, fish like trout really don't do well in warm water, but other fish like the native Colorado squawfish did really well. So life adapted to these warm water rivers. But then back in the 1930s, we decided to start putting dams up on the Colorado River to provide electricity for the growing population of the Southwest. And when you dam a river, you stop the river, right? So the river's flowing down with all of its mud, right? It hits the dam and the water stops. What happens to the mud? It just settles out in the reservoir behind it. The water that's in the impoundment, gradually it gets clearer and clearer. The other thing is that the water then stratifies. The cold water sinks to the bottom, the warm water sinks to the top. The water at the bottom of the reservoir, and if you've ever been swimming in a reservoir, you know that the top layer a lot of times warm. If you dive down, it gets cold. Coldest water is right at the base of the dam. And then when they release the water, that's what they release. So they're releasing water that's 38 degrees downstream. What do you think the squawfish is thinking? I used to have this great, warm, muddy stream that I really loved, and now you turned it into 38 degrees and crystal clear. So the native species start dying off. And what humans do is we're always tinkering with nature. We know trout love 38 degrees and clear, so we throw a bunch of trout in the Colorado River, and the native species die off. So that's thermal pollution from a different perspective. You're making a traditionally warm, muddy stream cold and clear. So humans mess with water all the time, and the aquatic species either adjust or die and go extinct. And now the native squawfish is on the endangered species list. So water use by humans has a lot of unintended consequences. Okay, this is something as a society we're going to have to deal with more and more as time goes on. We are really good at putting our head in the sand when it comes to water issues. We just don't want to deal with it because we're all dependent upon this. And when you try to rectify any problem with water, typically that means you're taking water from somewhere and giving it to somewhere else, and people who you're taking water from are not going to be happy about it. So there's lots of conflicts when it comes to water, especially here in the US. Well, if you look back at the numbers in terms of water consumption, you saw that irrigation was the big consumer. That's water we take out of the water cycle and we never put back. But if you've ever seen how irrigation occurs in the western US, typically what happens is the farmer opens up the floodgates, floods the field so that there's 2-3 inches of water standing. A lot of that water soaks into the ground for the plants, but a lot of it evaporates as well. So there's a tremendous amount of waste when it comes to irrigation. The other thing is that farming is a tough business. My grandparents were farmers. These were not rich folks. You don't see many people getting really rich off of family farms. So they're just eking it out year to year to year. So they're going to grow what they can make money on. Want to take a guess what the biggest cash crop in Arizona is? Arizona, you think of desert, right? We have some agriculture down there. They have to do a lot of irrigation to make stuff grow. You know what their highest cash crop is? Cotton. Is Arizona a place you think of when you think of where cotton is grown? You think of the Southeast, right? You think of Georgia. You think of all those areas that, were historic cotton fields. You don't think of Arizona. But the people there figured out they can make money growing cotton in Arizona, but they need a lot of water. Now, is that really a smart thing to plant a crop that requires a lot of water when you live in the desert? No. But these folks are just trying to make a living. Now, it would be smart if we would plant low water use crops like jojoba, yucca, things like that in desert environments, and save the cotton for the places that are naturally wet. That would be great to do. But now in Arizona, the farmers there have purchased equipment that's specific for getting cotton, right? If you say, no, we don't want you to grow cotton next year, we want you to grow yucca. Well, these farmers that are just barely making a living suddenly have to scrap $500,000 worth of equipment and buy all new equipment to grow this different crop. It doesn't work very well. Even though as a society we'd be much better off if they would grow a low water use crop there, from a practical standpoint, it's really difficult to tell farmers, hey, change what you're doing, spend a bunch of money to grow a different crop because we're running out of water. It's a really tough sell in ag country. So if we're not going to do that, maybe we can do irrigation a little better. And we can. Rather than just dumping water on fields where a great percentage of it evaporates, we could come up with better irrigation systems. One of it is called drip irrigation. It's basically a system of pipes buried a few inches under the soil. Water is flowing through the pipes and it slowly leaks out these holes in the pipes and dampens the soil, and you get just the right amount of water and essentially no evaporation. It cuts down your water use by maybe 90%. It's great. Really works well. And we rarely do it. The reason we rarely do it is these drip irrigation systems are expensive. Farmers don't have a lot of spare cash lying around. I don't know of a single farmer that wouldn't like to go to the system. Farmers don't want to waste money. Farmers are among the most conservative folks I know. They hate waste. But they don't have $500,000 lying around to put a drip irrigation system in their field. So the cost of going to a new technology in a sector of the economy where there just isn't a lot of money for investment is really difficult. So at this point in time, we're simply not conserving our way out of this problem. Places like Phoenix, Denver, Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, these big cities in the western US where you have over 1 million people and yet no substantial body of water to serve them. You guys watched the Mulholland video earlier this semester. You see the enormous lengths the city of Los Angeles has gone through to get water. They're stealing water from 6 different rivers. One river is 600 miles away. And they're bringing water to LA through pipelines, canals. Phoenix does the same thing. If you've ever been to Phoenix, you know there's this huge system of canals. It's bringing water from the Colorado River 200 miles away. Tucson brings water from the Colorado River 100 to 200 miles away. Denver brings water from the other side of the Rocky Mountains. Boulder. Greeley gets its water from all the way high up in Poudre Canyon. So all these cities have to go great distances to get water and divert water. And as these cities continue to grow, they demand more water. And as time goes on, there's just not going to be enough of it. So again, we talked about the LA aqueduct. 150 million gallons of water a day. From the Owens Valley, Mono Lake, Feather River, Colorado River. You saw how the Mono Lake levels dropped substantially once LA started taking water that flowed into it. We extract so much water from the Colorado River. The Colorado River originates here in the mountains of Colorado, Wyoming, flows into Utah, through the Grand Canyon, down along the Arizona, California border, where it heads into Mexico and dumps out into the Gulf of California. That's what used to happen. But now, here in the US, we extract so much water out of the Colorado River, by the time it gets into Mexico, it goes dry. It's only really, really rare years where the Colorado now will flow all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It's really unusual. It happened 3 or 4 years ago, and it's the first time in a decade it happened. Just a wet year. Most of the time, it dries up. So all those farmers in northern Mexico that used to rely on the Colorado River water for their farms have been out of business. So as a neighbor to the north, we have not been very nice neighbors to our Mexican brothers and sisters across the border. And in fact, what can happen is even worse, is that was fresh water that used to flow down to the Pacific. But now, since there's no fresh water, salt water is creeping into all these areas and severely damaging some of the delta ecosystems that we have in Mexico. So it's a real mess, all because of our appetite for water and our complete lack of water conservation. We really do a horrible job here in the US at conserving water. We just don't. And we don't because it doesn't cost us anything. Water is actually pretty cheap, and it shouldn't be. But it's not going to stay that way. During your lifetime, you're going to see the cost of water go up substantially. All right, I'm going to finish with this. A little bit about water law. This is a really quick treatment of water law. Water law I find really fascinating. I've had several students of mine in the past who like science, but they don't want to be scientists. And what they've done instead is they've become lawyers and they work in water law. As a lawyer, this is a really lucrative career. University of Denver Law School has a whole section devoted to water law, one of the best schools in the country for it. So we have different laws for surface water and groundwater. We're really not going to talk much about groundwater because it's super complicated, but we'll talk about surface water, okay? And in the United States, we really have 2 different laws when it comes to surface water. When I say surface water, I'm referring to lakes, streams, and rivers. So if you buy a house on a river, I think the expectation is I should be able to use some of that river water. In some states you can, and in some states you might not be able to touch it. It depends on the law. I think it's this assumption here in the US is that if I own land, anything on the land, it's mine. You know, I own the land. When you buy property, what you're buying is a bundle of rights. You might have the right to put a farm on it. You might not. You might have a right to the water on it. You might not. You might have a right to the oil and gas beneath it. You might not. My wife bought me a hot air balloon ride for my birthday a few years ago. And so we went up and took this hot air balloon ride out of Boulder, and we're floating along. And the balloon operator was really nervous. He goes, I was really afraid this was going to happen. And the wind patterns took him over this farm. And he goes, this woman has shot at us with a gun like 6 times in the last 2 years because she thinks she apparently owns not only the land, but apparently everything above her up to space. So when the balloons go over, she like takes her shotgun out and shoots at them. And the shotgun can't reach that far up, luckily, but she's still trying to shoot the balloon from the ground. And it's like, lady, you don't own the air above your land. And people make a lot of assumptions about what they can and can't do on your land. If you buy a piece of property, say in the middle of Fort Collins, you can't just do anything you want on it. You bought rights. What you didn't buy a right to was to have a pig farm. There are zoning laws that said if you buy land in this town, you can use it for this, that, and the other thing. You might be able to rent out part of it. You might not. You might be able to have 5 chickens on it. You might not. You don't have unlimited rights when you have land, and that comes to water too. The water right that you have really depends on where you live. This first water law that I have listed here is something called the riparian doctrine. So riparian is a scientific term for a riverbank. It's the area along the bank. So what this law says is that anybody who owns land adjacent to a lake, stream, or river has rights to the water. You can use some of that water. Now that doesn't mean you can go dump a bunch of cyanide in it. It doesn't mean you can just pump all the water out of the stream if you feel like it. There are restrictions, but you do have some rights to the water. And if you don't have land along that river, you don't have rights to it. You either have to purchase that water or purchase some rights to the water. It also says that it doesn't matter how big of a piece of property you have, everybody who has land along that water body has equal rights to it. So think about a lake. Let's say you have a lake. You could have one landowner that owns 95% of the shoreline, and then one other landowner that owns 5% of the shoreline. So this little tiny part that touches the water, one person's land, all the rest of it's owned by somebody else. They both have equal rights to the water. As long as you own some shoreline, you have just as much right to that water as anybody else. The person who has most of the shoreline doesn't have more rights than you. That's what this law says. You can use the water, but the law says it has to be used for natural and beneficial use. And once you're done using the water, you got to put it back, which isn't always easy. So natural and beneficial use. You think drinking water would qualify as natural and beneficial? The answer is yes. What about boating and recreation? Natural and beneficial? In the eyes of the law, the answer is yes. What about mining? think mining's natural and beneficial. Most people, I think, would probably shake their head. I don't know about that. According to the law, yes. Mining is natural and beneficial. I'll put up a list here in a minute. So you could use some of that water for mining if you wanted. Now out here in the West, as it turns out, we'll look at where these water laws pertain to in a minute. But out here in the West, we have a different water law. In general, the riparian doctrine is followed in the eastern part of the United States. And the second one, which is called doctrine of prior appropriation, is generally used west of the Mississippi. So here in Colorado, this is the law we have. It's not based on land ownership at all. And in fact, what happens to a lot of people is they buy land on lakes and rivers and they have no right to the water at all. It's whoever used the water first historically has top priority, which is actually a bunch of BS, because who actually used water in the Western US first? Yeah, the indigenous people, Native Americans. They don't count in this law because it's claimed that they signed away the right to this water in bad treaties 100, 150 years ago, which is crap because, of course, they signed treaties that weren't written in their language and they were lied to and all this other stuff. But in the eyes of the law, the Native Americans don't count. So who were the first people that came out and used water then? Frontiers, and in general, what were most of the early travelers to the West looking to do? Two things. Mining was the big one. Miner 49er, that the great gold rush of 1849, that's when lots of people finally came west. Remember, we acquired a lot of the land in the Western US right after the turn of the century in the 1800s. Lewis and Clark came out in 1804 and 1805 to explore it, and they came back and reported on just the amazing bounty of the West. But Easterners didn't start moving to the West right away. They saw it as a scary place. There were native people out there that would do them harm. It was dry. So it wasn't until gold was discovered in California in the late 1840s that a lot of people decided, I'm going to go west and try to get rich. So they were the first people that settled, were the miners. And if they didn't mine, then they were probably ranching or doing some sort of agriculture. So in general, in the Western US, it was the mining and agricultural community or communities that used the water first. So just like with riparian doctrine, you have to use the water for beneficial use. But in the eyes of the law, just about anything is beneficial use. Mining is beneficial, agriculture is beneficial, human use of it is beneficial. There's not too many things that aren't considered beneficial. Basically, if people can make money off of it, it's beneficial in the eyes of the law. The thing about this law, and the reason that it's used in the Western US, is that we typically have water shortages out here because it's a dry climate. This law makes it perfectly clear who has right to the water when there's shortages. And in fact, if you are living along a stream, you might be able to use the water part of the year, but when the water level drops, a mining company somewhere will say you can't take any more water out. We have the senior rights on this river. We need the water. You can't take any from us. We have a professor in our department, Dr. Elkins, and after being here a couple years, he decided he was going to open a whiskey distillery up in Estes Park. If you go up there, you can see the Elkins distillery. And he looked around and tried to find the right piece of land. And what he was trying to find was a piece of land where he could put his distillery and buy senior water rights. so that he would always have water for his distillery. And it took him a long time to find the right piece of land. And he had to pay an extra premium just to acquire those water rights that were probably sold off by a mining company some time ago. So water is big business out here. So again, out in the eastern part of the US where we have lots of water, big lakes where water shortages aren't a problem, we use the riparian doctrine. The riparian doctrine works really well when there's lots of water. Basically, there's lots of water. Anybody who lives on the water can use as much of it as they want. We have so much of it that we don't have to worry about disputes or somebody taking out so much that it's going to negatively impact somebody else. But out here in the West, we don't have an endless supply of water. So the riparian doctrine doesn't work. So there has to be a clear way of delineating who gets water when there's shortages. And we do that basically first come, first serve. Whoever used the water first historically has those rights. And then they can sell those rights to other people. So usually if you have water rights out here, probably started out that some mining company had the water rights. I used to live in South Dakota. There was a mountain across the street from my town. It was the water rights were all owned by a mining company. There was nothing to mine on that mountain. There was no gold, no silver, no nothing. But they actually claimed that mountain just for the water. And then they sold the rights off to a developer for a lot of money. They made more on selling the property that year than they did on mining gold. But they had these water rights that dated back over 100 years. So what is beneficial? Well, the laws had to deal with what is beneficial. Now, sometimes if both parties that are disputing water use have equal right to it, then it may default as to, well, which person is actually doing something that's the most beneficial. Then they will have right to the water when there's a shortage over the other person. Well, in general, domestic use is highest. Water for people, keeping us alive. That makes sense. And water for cities. And then water for food, irrigation and livestock. Then water for energy, water for mining. Look where recreation is. Recreation is actually dead last. So if you like to raft, you like to fish, you like to do things on water, those uses are secondary to everything else, even mining. Mining always gets water before recreation does. Now, lots of people don't like that. Back when these laws were established, recreation wasn't really a big part of the economy. Now it's a huge part of the economy. There are places down around Alamosa, ranching or rafting companies that have a hard time staying in business when the water is low because mining companies and irrigation of livestock is sucking so much water out of the stream that the stream goes dry and they can't raft, and it shuts down a whole industry. But they really have little legal ground to stand on because they are dead last when it comes to what is the most beneficial use of water in the eyes of the law. Remember, this is all in the eyes of the law. It's not what makes sense to you or me. It's what has been adjudicated in courts of law over the last 150 years or so.